Good morning, dear children. Welcome back. In today's session, we will continue our learning of Class 6, Term 3, Unit 1 in History, Society and Culture in Ancient Tamilnadu, the Sangam Age. This is part 2 of the videos. Come, dears, let us learn. Before going into today's session, let us have a recap of what we learned in the last one. Dear children, we learned about Sangam Age. We learned about the rule of Movendars, the three great kings, Chera, Chola and Pandya. We learned that the Sangam refers to the association of poets who flourished under the royal patronage of the Pandya kings at Madurai. The poems composed by these poets are known as Sangam literature, and the period in which these poems were composed is called as the Sangam Age. We also learned about Movendars, or the three great kings who controlled the territories of Tamizhagam during Sangam age. Dear children, in this session we will discuss about minor chieftains, Sangam polity, code, its army and understand the status of women. Dear children, apart from the three great kings, there were several brave, independent, minor chieftains. The name I is derived from the ancient Tamil word Ayar, A-Y-A-R, Ayar meaning shepherd. What is the meaning of word Ayar? It is shepherd. Among I chiefs of Sangam age, Andiran, Tindiran, Nanan were the important names. Dear children, the Vellalars constituted the ruling and land-owning class in the ancient Tamilnadu. So, who were the ruling and land-owning people? They were the Vellalars. The famous Vellars were the seven patrons, Kadayelu Vallalgar. They were Pari, Kari, Uri, Pagan, Ai, Adiyaman and Nalli. About these kings you have already learned in your lower classes. They were popular for their generous patronage of Tamil poets. They were very generous people, and because of their generosity we are calling them as Kadayelu Vallalgal. Kirar was a village chief. Now let us learn about the Sangam polity. That is how the kingship was carried over. The kingship was hereditary, that is, it was transferred from father to the son. The king was called Ko. It is a shortened form of Kon. The other names, the king had other names also, Vendan, Kon, Mannan, Kotravan and Irevan were the other titles by which the king was addressed. So king was addressed with different names like Vendan, Kon, Mannan, Kotravan and Irevan. The eldest son of the reigning king generally succeeded to the throne. So the next king, the prince who was the first one, the eldest one, was the next king. The coronation ceremony was known as Arasu Kattilirundal or Mudisootu Villa. The crown prince was known as Komahan. What was the name of the crown prince? It was Komahan. He was addressed Komahan. While the young ones were known as Ilango, Ilanchelian and Ilanjiral. King held a daily darbar, Nallavai, at which he heard and resolved all the disputes. So the king used to conduct a darbar, and it was called as Nallavai, and in that he heard the disputes and resolved it. The income to the state was through taxation. Like in our present period, the income was through taxation. Land tax was a main source of revenue, and it was called as Irai. What is the name of land tax collected? It was called as Irai, I-R-A-I, Irai. This apart, the state collected tolls and customs, that is Sungam, tributes and fines. So apart from Irai, there were tolls, there were customs or Sungam and tributes and fines which were collected for the revenue as taxes. Dear children, the kings and soldiers wore the heroic anklet called as Veera Kadal. And on the anklet, the name and the achievement of the wearer were blazoned. That is, they wore an anklet, and in that it was prominently displayed what was his achievement and what is the name of the king. Learn the word blazon. B-L-A-Z-O-N. Blazon is to display prominently. Spies were used not only to find out what was happening within the country but also in foreign countries. So they had spies both finding out the things happening in the country as well as from outside. A wound in the back was considered a disgrace. If the person had a wound at the backside, it was considered as disgrace. And there were instances of kings fasting unto death because they had suffered such a wound in the battle. Now let us understand about the court during Sangam age. The king's court was called as Arasavai. What was the name? It was called as Arasavai. And the king occupied a ceremonious throne in the court called as Arayanai. So the throne was called as Arayanai. In the court, the king was surrounded by the officials, the distinguished visitors, and court poets. You can see in the picture, king sat on a big ceremonious throne and he was surrounded by officials. There may be the ministers and advisors and distinguished visitors who came visiting the king, and the poets, court poets. The rulers had five-fold duties. There were 5 duties, main duties for the rulers. They were encouraging learning, performing rituals, presenting gifts, protecting people, and punishing the criminals. So what were the duties of the king? Encourage learning, performing rituals, presenting gifts, protecting their people, and punishing the criminals. Ambassadors were employed by the kings and they played a significant role. Now, an ambassador is a diplomatic agent who has a highest rank in a foreign government. He is treated as a royal person in the other country. Ambassador of a particular country is treated as an important guest in the other country. The king was assisted by a number of officials, and there were so many people helping out the king, and they were divided into 2 groups, that is 5-member committee and 8-member group. The 5-member committee was known as Aim Perung Guru, and the 8-member group was called as Enberayam. Now let us learn about the army. The king's army consisted of 4 divisions, that is infantry, cavalry, elephants and chariot forces, and they were called as Chaduranga. Now let us learn more about army. The army was known as Padai, P-A-D-A-I, Padai, and the chief of the army was known as Thani Talaivan. The prominent weapons used during this period were swords, Kedayam, which is a shield, Tomaram, which is lance, spears, bows and arrows. So various weapons were used and it was very, very skilled ones. Tomaram is mentioned as a missile to be thrown at the enemy from a distance. So our army even had a missile which could be thrown at the enemies. Dear children, the place where the weapons were kept was known as Padai Kottil. P-A-D-D-A-I-K-O-T-T-I-L. Padai Kottil. The forts were protected by deep moats. Deep moats means a deep, wide ditch surrounding a castle which is filled with water, and it is intended as a defense against the attack. So it was filled with water and maybe you could find crocodiles in there. And there were deep trenches, deep down and dug under the ground. The war drum was worshipped as a deity. You can see the drum which announces the war, the beginning of the war and end of the war, were worshipped as a deity, as a god. Now let us learn about the law and justice that were carried out in the Sangam period. The king was a final authority for appeal. So he was the last or the final decision maker. In the capital town, the court of justice was called as Avai. Like we have a district court and a high court. In our state capital, we have high court, and the various districts, they have district courts. Same way, in capital town, the court of justice was called as Avai. And in the villages, it was called as Mandram. Mandram served as a place for dispensing justice. Punishment was always severe. The punishment that was given was very severe. Execution, that is, chopping of the head or killing, was ordered for the theft cases. Somebody tried to steal something, and if he's caught, he was murdered. The punishment awarded for other crimes included beheading, that is, chopping off the head, mutilation of the offending limbs of the body, that is, chopping off the part of the body which was involved in the crime, and torture and imprisonment and imposition of fines. They were tortured, or they were imprisoned, or they were asked to pay huge amount as fine. Now let us learn about the local administration. The entire kingdom was called as Mandalam. What is the name of the entire kingdom? It was called as Mandalam. And Mandalams were divided into Nadus. There were so many Nadus under Mandalams. And Kuram was subdivision of Nada. And the Ur was a village classified into Perur, that is big village. The Ur was classified into Perur or big village, Sirur small village, and Mudur an old village, depending on its population, size, and antiquity. Antiquity, Antiquity. Antiquity is the past. So the Ur or the village was classified into Perur, big village, Sirur, small one, and Mudur, depending on its population, how populated the place is, and what is the size of the place, as well as what is the ancient history of the place. Pattanam was a name for a coastal town, and Puhar was the general term for a harbour town. So if it was a coastal town, it was called as Pattanam, and if it was a harbour town, it was called as Puhar. The important towns were Puhar, Urayur, Korkai, Madurai, Muziri, Vanji or Karur and Kanchi. So these were the important towns during the Sangam age. Now let us learn about the various Thinais or the tract-based Sangam Society. The landform was divided into 5 Thinais or eco-regions. The regions were called as Thinais. Kurinji was a hilly region, and the occupation was hunting gathering, and the people were called as Kuravar Kurattiyar. The deity for worship was Murugan. Mullai is a forest region, and the occupation, since it is forest, the occupation was herding, taking care of the cattle or rearing cattle, and the people were called as Ayar, Aichiyar, and the deity was Mayan. Marudam was the riverine tract, that is the plains. The occupation was agriculture, and the people were called as Uravan, Urattiyar. The deity was Indran, the rain god. Nedal or coastal region, the fishing or salt making was the main occupation. The people were called as Parandavar and Nulatiyar, and the deity was Varunan. Palai or parched land or false land, and the occupation was the heroic deeds. The people were called as Maravar, Marathiyar, and the deity was Kotravai. Dear children, land was classified according to its fertility. It was also classified according to the fertility. Marudam was called as Menbulam or fertile land, and it produced paddy and sugarcane, whereas the rest of landscape excluding Nedal was called Vanbulam or hard land, and it produced pulses and dry grains. So Marudam was called as Menbulam, and it gave the crops produced were paddy and sugarcane, and the rest of the places except for Nedal was called as Vanbulam or hard land, and it produced the pulses and dry grains. Children, come, we will see the status of women, how women were treated during Sangam period. There was no restriction for women in social life. They were not restricted by any means. They were learned and wise women. Women who had access to education, and they were learned people. 40 women poets have lived and left behind their valuable works. Important women, nearly 40 of them, have left their works behind. Marriage was a matter of self-choice. There was no compulsion on marriage. It was the person's choice, individual choice, and there was no compulsion. However, chastity or karpa was considered the highest virtue of women. Sons and daughters had equal shares in their parents' property. Both men and women had equal share. Boy and girl had equal share in parents' property. Women poets of Sangam age are Avvayar, Velli Vetiyar, Kakai Padaniyar, Adi Mandiyar, and Pun Mudiyar. So these were the important poets of Sangam age. Before winding up today's session, let us have a recap of what we discussed in this session. We discussed about the minor chieftains and Sangam polity, court, army, and we understood the status of women. Dear children, in the next session, we will learn about the art, occupation, festivals, trade contacts with other places. Now let us understand about the religious beliefs and social divisions during that period. The primary deity of Tamils were Seyon or Murugan. So the main deity was Murugan. Other gods worshipped during Sangam period were Shivan, Mayan, that is Vishnu, Indiran, Varunan, and Kotravai. So the other gods other than Murugan, they were Shivan, Mayan, Indiran, Varunan, and Kotravai. The hero stone or Nattukal worship was in practice. So it was always there was hero worship or hero stone worship. Buddhism and Jainism also coexisted. So along with Hinduism, there were Buddhism and Jainism. Caste did not develop in Tamizhagam as it did in the northern India. So there were no caste system. Varuna system, or it is occupation-based caste, came into the Dravidian south comparatively in later period. Before winding up today's session, let us have a recap of what we discussed in this session. We discussed about the minor chieftains and Sangam polity, court, army, and we understood the status of women. Dear children, in the next session, we will learn about the art, occupation, festivals, trade contacts with other places. Time for worksheet number 2. Answer the following. Question number 1. The chief of the army was known as dash. The chief of the army was known as dash. Question number 2. Name 5 Thinais mentioned in the Sangam literature. Name the 5 Thinais mentioned in the Sangam literature. Question number 3. Discuss the status of women in Sangam society. Discuss the status of women in Sangam society. With that, we wind up today's session, my dear children. Thank you for watching. For more videos, please subscribe our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Samacheer Kalvi Guide. Thank you. Stay blessed.